back and reference the materials and discussion for your own, at your own convenience. And we'll post that if we can, or at least send you the link to the WebEx for the recording so that you have that. A few housekeeping items before we get started. If you can, please, everyone mute your mic. And just go ahead and you should be able to see where the participants are to go in and mute your mic. That will help the sound quality overall. And then along through the presentations, if you can use your chat box and go ahead and enter questions that you have along the way through the course of the presentations into the chat box. We'll be monitoring those, and if we don't get to it through the course of the seminar, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions along the way. We definitely want to have Q&A sessions after each presentation, so I really want to hear questions that you have or suggestions that we may have as we move forward. So we definitely want to provide plenty of opportunity for that. We're going to start with the Schedule D with Crystal Collins. Crystal is Senior Director of Fiscal Policy Analysis at THEC, and we're delighted that she is able to join us today for the presentation. Her presentation will be about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. Hopefully wrapping up by about 9:15 or so. Then we're going to stop and have a break. Everybody go take a break, get your extra coffee or whatever. We'll keep the meeting running. So we'll keep it open. And then right at 9:30, we will start the next part of the meeting, which is a review of the facilities inventory by Art Litsky. And I'll do an introduction of Art later when we get to that portion at 9:30. Before I go further, I want to just mention also that there is a SCUP seminar this Wednesday, which is called Physical Distancing in Classrooms. It's 12:30 Central, 1:30 Eastern. I know that many of you are working on the distancing requirements in classrooms. Probably they are contacting you about spaces in the classrooms, the number of stations that you have, and I'm certain that many of you are working very directly on this. So if you're a member of SCUP, definitely if you'd like to and it's of interest to you, it probably will be a very good conversation if you want to see what others are doing. And I don't know if you have to be a member of SCUP or not, but probably someone there in your organization is, and you can would be able to figure out a way to jump onto that. So I'd like to do an introduction first about why we are doing this. We are going to be implementing a process to move the Physical Facility Inventory Survey. The acronym is PFIS program that currently resides on the TVR website. Some of you are doing data entries into the PFIS for the SPAs that severed. Definitely all of the 5 SPAs and TBR are currently using that program for data entries, whether it's a direct data entry or an export-import function. So we are planning to move that program to THEC. Now, this isn't going to happen tomorrow or next week or even next month, probably, but you will have plenty of time for that transition, so we want to make it as seamless as possible. There will be coordination with the ones that have an auto sort of export-import function into the database now, so we'll need to figure all that out with your IT teams as we move along. So that is the first thing that's going on that we want to talk about. Also, the primary goal really is the accuracy of the database, and because there's so many very important functions of the inventory, we want to be making improvements with regard to the accuracy of the data and probably just as importantly, the consistency of the data. And when you're looking at this, space in all of higher ed and all of the state of Tennessee, this, of course, is a significant challenge. And the degree to which we can all be working together in having a systematic, I'll call it, guideline for process for the upkeep of the data and a process for monitoring changes and confirming those changes will help us make those incremental improvements as we move along. So we don't have a schedule for this. When we do, we will share that with you so that you can anticipate it and we can be moving together about what we need to do. Then, of course, today we're talking about Schedule D and PFI. Then Friday we have the seminar on the THEC formula. The following weeks we'll be following up with the individual institutions. The SPAs will be our primary contact. And we will be following up and just doing an overview look of the Schedule D, the facilities inventory, and the THEC formula information, which is, for those of you familiar with the Schedule D, is the tab 2 on the Schedule D. So we're just going to be doing a kind of a broad overview, primarily for the purpose of seeing anything that kind of jumps out, any big questions that come up, talking about the consistency of data as it comes forward, particularly in the capital budget. And so that is the purpose of those phone calls. And they are all already set up. If you feel like you need to be a part of that conversation, just contact your primary PFI person, and you may want to operate as a team. It's simply completely up to you about how you want to handle those phone calls. And so that is happening next week and the following week. So I've talked about the goals and so on, and the overall steps in moving all of the data to THEC. Oh, one other thing, this is also related to the facility survey. And we're, of course, the PFIS and the survey are all one database with THEC, and that program is one program. So we're having similar and probably more intensive conversations about the survey information, improvements we may want to make along the way, with the goal of again, the accuracy of the data, consistency of the data, and also ease of use is a big thing. So to the extent that we're able to make any improvements that make the programs easier to use, more functional and informative for you at the campus level, and as well as being a tool for information at the state level, that is our goal. So we appreciate your taking the time today, and so we'll go ahead and get started. And Crystal Collins is going to present on the Schedule D. So, Crystal?
Good morning. Thank you, Patty. I will preface this conversation by saying today was the day that my lawn people decided to show up. So hopefully, hopefully I won't be interrupted. They've already come by and mowed and weed whacked. I don't know what's left, probably a leaf blower. So I apologize ahead of time if there's some background noise here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to you this morning. I know since the capital process at THEC was split away from the fiscal division, a lot of the conversations that we used to have with the facilities people on campus have rightfully been moved over to Patty and her team. And so some of you might recognize me and some of you might not. I've been with THEC working on the outcomes-based funding formula since 2012. And so the Schedule D and what we're going to talk about today, the fixed cost component of the funding formula, is very important to us in the fiscal division, and it is a vital piece of the outcomes formula, which we use in order to distribute all funding from the state to our community colleges and our universities. So all state appropriations flow through the outcomes-based funding formula. And just thinking about that, what are the main components of the funding formula? So why are we here today? So there are three major or three parts of the funding formula. There are the weighted outcomes, and those are the things that you've probably heard your presidents or other people on your campus talk about: graduation rate, how many degrees you're producing, are students progressing towards degrees. There's the quality assurance funding piece, which many of you may be familiar with, maybe not. That's been around since the late 1970s. And that is just looking at the quality of education that is being provided by your institution. So how many of your students are passing their licensure exams once they graduate? What is their satisfaction? What is the faculty satisfaction on your campus? And then the final piece is fixed costs. And this fixed cost calculation accounts for about 20% of the total points generated in the funding formula. So the way that the formula works is we count a whole bunch of things and we make them into points. And then we monetize those points. And so the fixed cost component accounts for about 20% of those total points generated each year. For instance, in the most recent recommendation that we ran last November, that you all provided Schedule Ds to us in September and October of 2019, THEC recommended about $1.1 billion in state appropriations for our community colleges and universities, and of that, the fixed cost calculation accounted for about $245 million. So that's not an insignificant amount of money. That's a significant amount of money for institutions on an annual basis. And because of that, it is paramount that we make sure that the information that is used in order to calculate that portion of the funding formula is as accurate as possible. So the fixed cost component itself is made up of 4 parts, and this is a legacy, what we refer to as a legacy measure. The fixed cost component has been part of the funding formula in Tennessee for 20 or 30 years at least. The outcomes portion has only been around since 2011. We migrated the fixed costs from the old enrollment model to the new performance model when we moved to that model in 2011. These 4 parts have been a part of the fixed costs since it was created, and they include E&G square footage, utilities, rent, and equipment replacement value. So E&G square footage, all of this information is provided to us through the appropriation request process that starts in August of every year. The E&G square footage is reported as part of the Schedule D, which is what we're going to talk about today. Utilities are reported as part of the Schedule E. Rent is reported as part of the Schedule F. And equipment is reported separately as part of what we refer to as the Part 2. So the E&G square footage is then monetized. So you report to us how many square feet on your campus by building that we then aggregate is used for education and general purposes. We then monetize that number by multiplying it by an annual maintenance and operation rate. And we do provide that information to campuses upon request. That is a legacy rate that is inflated every year using that higher education price index, the HEPI rate. And these rates are universally applied to all campuses. So community colleges, a square foot at a community college is worth the same thing as a square foot at a university. Portable or modular buildings receive half that rate. So if the rate is, say, $6.58 a square foot, a portable or modular building would be valued at half of that rate. And then another component of the E&G square footage is this idea of a premium for non-renovated older square footage. So anything that is 20 or more years old receives a additional 1/3 of that rate. And that is to recognize that that building, being older than 20 years old, requires more maintenance and upkeep from your campus than, say, something that was built in the last 4 or 5 years. And so instead of being worth, say, 1, that E&G square footage for that 20-year-old building is worth 1.33. Of particular interest, and as a way to make all of us feel old, anything born in 2000, built in 2000 or older is now considered a non-renovated or square footage and receives this 20 or more year old additional rate. So that's the basis of the outcomes-based formula and the basis of the fixed cost component. Today we're going to focus on the Schedule D. This is an example of Schedule D that was provided last year from Tennessee Tech. And this should look familiar to all of you. This schedule itself, the elements that are included here. I chose this as an example because this is a great example of what a Schedule D looks like after the institution and THEC have discussed all of the information that is provided. It also was a good example of an institution that followed instructions when filling out the Schedule D and submitting to us. For instance, you'll notice several buildings that are highlighted in yellow. Those were buildings that were identified as new construction that would be new to the Schedule D compared to last year, and the instructions do request that you highlight anything in yellow that is new so that it stands out to us and we can see it. You'll also notice that those buildings, the Lab Science and Lecture Hall building, were identified with the date that that building would be built. And then we're also identified with the percent of year online. So when that building was estimated to be completed. So the Lab Science building was not going to open in August. It was not going to open until October. So it was only going to be online for 75% of the year, while the Lecture Hall was estimated to open at the beginning of the fall semester. And so would be online for 100%. Also here you will see things that are highlighted in green or this light color. Those are things where through a verification process, THEC noticed something that was different, and we'll talk about the verification process here later in the presentation.
I got her back.
So the green lines here show where we had a conversation with the institution and then satisfied the questions that THEC had. We then highlight those in green so that we know that those questions have been asked and answered. And though off the side here, we provide our comments off to the side here in in another column. Before we move on, I just wanted to go ahead and show what a Schedule D looks like. This is the actual Schedule D. You all should be very familiar with it. This is an Excel file that is sent to you every year. You'll be receiving this from us in about 2 months with the same appropriations request that we send you every year. THEC goes through a 5-year formula review process every 5 years. The last one was in 2015. We had begun our 5-year review process for 2020 in February, but due to the pandemic, we actually had to postpone the review, and we'll be starting that up again later this year, beginning of next year. With the postponement of the 5-year review, THEC is planning on using for 1 more year the formula that was used for the 2015 to 2020 funding formula request process. And that means that at this time, we don't anticipate seeing any changes to the fixed cost component and the request process going into this fall. We're trying to maintain as much as possible familiar things because we know institutions are having to face these other existential questions and very different problems related to how their institution is responding to COVID and returning to campuses in the fall and spring. But so this facilities inventory, this will probably be the spreadsheet that you get from us. And as Patty mentioned, here on the second tab, the PFI summary, this is a very important piece of this process for the submission to THEC to make sure that this physical facilities inventory is filled out correctly and appropriately because it is used by Patty and her team. So thinking specifically about the Schedule D and the elements within it, you're probably thinking that we ask for a lot of these things and we don't use them. I'll tell you that everything on this list we use in order to determine whether or not that square footage should be built into the fixed cost component of the funding formula. I'm not going to talk about every single one of these. All of these elements are defined in our instruction document that you receive each year as part of the appropriation request process. But I did want to highlight a few of these so that you know how we use them to get to the actual fixed cost request. Weirdly, the building name is very important. One of our very first steps, and I'll talk about this in the verification process, is to compare last year's Schedule D to this year's Schedule D to look for changes. And the way that we line that up is with your building name and then the number that is provided by the institution. The year built is also important, again, related to non-renovated square footage. And then year of major renovation is part of that as well. If a building that is over 20 years old has gone through a major renovation, that building is no longer considered to be over 20 years old and then does not receive the additional 1/3 premium on their square footage. And the federal government defines a major renovation as anything where the renovation costs 25% of the total cost replacement value of the building, and that we utilize the US DOE's definition for major renovation. I did want to highlight specifically the building use code here, the 2-digit code that indicates the primary function of the structure. So structures are identified as either education in general and purpose, or identified as auxiliary enterprises. And this is very important to us because the state has a longstanding policy that it does not provide funding to institutions for auxiliary space. And so this is why you hear us talk about E&G square footage all of the time, because the funding formula and the fixed cost component of the funding formula is concerned specifically about education in general space. And so that is space where its primary purpose or primary function is part of the core function of the institution. So supporting teaching, researching, public service, the mission of the institutions. Structures with primary function of providing services to students, faculty, or staff that are intended to be self-supporting or revenue generating are coded as auxiliary enterprises. And within the instruction document that we provide every year, those codes are found on page 4. And I think it's in general, anything below 40 is considered education in general, and then 40 and above is considered auxiliary in nature. If a change in a building use code from a previous year to this year is something that will show an exception during our verification process. So if for some reason the building use code changes, please highlight that and then provide a comment. Because we will notice it during our verification process and provide feedback and questions based on that. Also of interest here, the current year E&G square footage, we do ask for, and I know this has been the thing that has caused a lot of consternation over the years. We ask for current year and estimated upcoming. And the reason that we do that is when we're running the funding formula in the fall, we are actually running the formula for the next fiscal year. So what we're trying to do is to recognize the square footage and the footprint and the fixed cost operation that your campus will be under in the following fiscal year. For institutions that have a very steady footprint, that's not a very hard thing to do to estimate what you'll look like in the next fiscal year. A lot of our community colleges are the same year to year. For the universities, we understand that that can be more difficult to try and estimate what your square footage will be when the next fiscal year rolls around, especially because we're asking you almost a full year before that fiscal year even begins, and maybe even up to 18 months before you might see activities in a building at the end of the next fiscal year. But related to E&G square footage in the Schedule D, both the current year and the estimated upcoming, those are self-calculating columns based on gross square footage and auxiliary square footage. So while the E&G is the most important thing to THEC related to the fixed costs, ensuring that what you put in the gross square footage and auxiliary sections is what actually generates that number. So because of that, making sure that the gross square footage and auxiliary revenue reported is accurate is paramount to making sure that the E&G square footage reported is accurate. When determining the upcoming year E&G square footage, the calculation is very similar, except for we add this idea of percent of year online. So if you believe that that building is going to be offline, or you know it's going to be offline for a renovation, then that percent of year offline should be something less than 100. If you know that that new construction isn't going to be open on the first day of your classes, then that percent of year online should be less than 100. Will be part of the verification process as well, to check to see if what that percent of year online looks like. And so that column is very important to us as well. So in order to accurately report the upcoming E&G square footage, that is the driver for all of the fixed cost allocations. Properly filling out this column is very important, and we understand that your timelines are fluid, and because of that, anytime during the funding formula process, so you submit this information to us in September. If for some reason your construction deadlines or your maintenance timelines change between that submission in September and when we lock the formula at the end of October, please let us know. If you get ahead of schedule and so your building is going to be 100% online, if you let us know, we're happy to update that percent online function so that you get full credit for that square footage in your schedule D, and therefore in the fixed costs. As we've mentioned here, the non-renovated square footage is also important because of that premium. And so this column is self-calculated based on the year built and the year of major renovation. So those two columns then become important to make sure that you are actually reporting the correct non-renovated square footage. And as I mentioned, a major renovation is a renovation that costs 25% or more of the estimated replacement cost of the building, and that extends its useful life. Consistency in reporting of these elements and the others included are paramount to proper funding calculations for the Schedule D, and will limit the number of questions that we have to go back and forth on during the verification process that occurs after it's submitted. So the verification process itself, what happens once you actually send us the Schedule D? A lot, actually. We spend a lot of time. We say around the office, 80% of the funding formula is outcomes, but 80% of our time on the funding formula is fixed costs. So the effort that we're putting into not only the Schedule D, but E and F is very high compared to the funding that is distributed by that piece in the funding formula, mostly because that information is self-reported by institutions. It's not going through an audit and verification process through our student information system like the outcomes do. And because it's frankly more complicated because of these rates and these questions that we ask related to the type of square footage and the type of leases that we would provide funding for, as opposed to the outcomes, which we have an operational definition that tells us exactly what to count. So once the data is received from each of the campuses, THEC undergoes an extensive verification process. If this verification process results in any quote errors, and that just means where a flag is thrown up on something that our verification process recognizes as different, THEC then will reach back out to you at your campuses to begin an iterative discussion on discrepancies. And the goal is always to get to the correct answer, whatever that is. So to be able to say, yes, we asked a question about this, and yes, this was reported in alignment with our instructions, and yes, we can say that it was treated the same as it would have been treated on any other campus had it been reported there. So the first most basic comparison that we do is as I mentioned earlier, is we compare the final revised Schedule D from last year to the one that you've provided us this year. And what that means is we look at what you said you thought was going to happen, and then what you think is going to happen the next year, and we look for differences. because buildings don't really change very much. The differences that we'll see is and I should say buildings square footage doesn't really change very much unless you're going through a process where you're re-looking at how all of your building square footage was calculated. I think UT went through that process last year. That will lead to differences across all buildings. Or can lead to differences across all buildings. That's different than, say, a building that gains 10,000 or loses 10,000 square feet because of a change in use, or because of being offline for maintenance, or because of new construction or addition added to that building. And so we start by comparing the previous year to the new year, and we look for any changes there. Related to new construction, so let's say a new building shows up, so of course you're going from not existing last year to existing this year. The verification process will immediately look for that percent online, and then we'll look for that comment. So I say down here at the bottom, accurate and copious comments. If there's not a comment for a new building, we'll ask a question about it regardless. So it behooves all of us for you to provide a comment for any sort of new construction that not only identifies it as new construction, but tells us when it's going to be online. And you know, the beginning of fall semester or month, or you know, some sort of indication, so we can determine the percent online and verify from the comment the percent online. Oftentimes we'll also verify any of those changes with action within the SBC. We also know buildings that have been approved for capital construction through the capital process, and so we'll do a verification there on that building to see if it aligns with the things that were provided through the capital request process at THEC or through the SBC process with the state funding board. Again, highlight anything in yellow that is different from what it was previously on the Schedule D. That will help us immensely. And again, any new construction identified here leads to the next verification step of the percent online. I mentioned a difference in usage. So E&G square footage in buildings coded as auxiliary is probably where we have the most verification questions. So when we last looked at or last reviewed the fixed cost component, which was during the 2015 5-year review process, we had started to look at it during the 13-14 formula review related to expo centers and ag barns, and I'm just waiting for Carl Manka to look up while I say expo centers and ag barns. There he is. So during that process with Carl to try and address these structures that may have been determined as auxiliary in nature, but or impermanent structures because of the way that they're built, and making sure that they were treated as legacy buildings as they were asked to be taken over by institutions, and so that they could receive state funding. During that process, one of the things we did identify was we needed a consistent way of identifying how institutions could show that they were using auxiliary space for E&G purposes. This mostly occurs related to physical education. So your physical education courses will often use fitness centers or athletic facilities, which by definition are considered auxiliary enterprises, in order to offer classes, which are E&G activities. They are for the quote unquote academic and instruction component of the institution. So the instruction document that we provide every year gives a thorough explanation of how to identify E&G space within an auxiliary building. The general rule here is that the facility, the square footage that you're reporting must be used an average of 15 hours per week for any combination of instruction, research, or public service in any semester. So it's not 15 hours a week for the entire year, it's in any semester. So you can think of it as it's half the recommended THEC utilization rate. So 15 hours per week on academic instruction, research, or public service activities. The The important thing here is the documentation. So it's not just that you're telling us that it's happening. We need to have some sort of source document that shows what is happening in that square footage. And this is where it can get difficult because, again, we realize we might be asking you for something 18 months before it would potentially happen. A lot of you will have received questions from me or Stephen related to the changes in square footage from auxiliary to E&G. We try and be as diligent as possible with the understanding that there are some limitations from you and your campuses of what you're able to provide us, but also understanding that we need to be able, if we are audited every year on the funding formula. If there is a question about the fixed cost component, we need to be able to provide information to the auditors related to why that square footage, which was previously not funded by the state, is now funded by the state. Because again, it is moving $245 million between institutions, which is not an insignificant sum of money. So providing that E&G square footage information, that 15 credit hours per week, is very important to us. Let's see, non-renovated square footage. I think we've talked about this enough. We do reconcile your year built and your year of major renovation, which we've talked about is greatly important to us. So if for some reason you're reporting a building that was, say, built in the 1920s, you have not provided us a year of major renovation, but that building went through a renovation in, say, 2019, 2018, and you're still reporting all of that square footage as non-renovated, that will kick a flag to us, and we will ask you about it. So if you're not reporting any non-renovated square footage, but you haven't provided a year of major renovation, then we'll ask a question about that. If you've reported a year of major renovation and are still reporting non-renovated square footage, we're going to ask you about that. So those three pieces definitely work together in tandem to determine whether or not, or what your non-renovated square footage is. And the last thing I would say here is that comments are your friend. We read all of them, and our goal is not to ask a question that has already been answered, because that's a waste of time for all of us. So if there is a comment section for you to provide any comments on any buildings, please feel free to do that. I know that some institutions will provide notes in cells. That's also great. That's actually how we keep track of all of the emails that we send to you. For any building where we've asked a question about, say, your E&G square footage, there will be a comment in there, and it will include all of the email traffic between us and you. And then we save all of your emails, again, for audit purposes within our database. And then the last thing I would say is, hopefully that instructions document can be a useful guide and support for you while you're filling out your Schedule D. I will readily admit that it has not been updated in several years. That was something that was supposed to be part of our 5-year review process, was this idea of revisiting the fixed costs. And that will probably be part of the next process when we revisit again later this year and beginning of next year. But if you have a question that is not answered in that instruction document, do not hesitate to reach out to us, and we will provide on the front end, and we'll provide as much information as we can. So, Patty, that's all I have. I am available and ready to answer any questions, or more likely say, I have no idea and I'll look into it. So I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you, Crystal. That was fantastic. That was a great overview. So I'd like to open this up to the group and see if there are any questions out there. I'm monitoring the chat. I don't see any questions coming through there, but if anyone has any questions, this is a great opportunity. If you have that question, it's likely that others do as well. So just speak up if you have any questions.
I never know if the lack of questions means that I did a good job or I bored everyone to death. I will say one last thing here as we're moving into the formula process for this fall. Some of you may have worked with Alex Monday, who is our assistant director of fiscal policy. Alex is actually starting a PhD program in about 4 weeks at the University of Georgia. And so he will be moving on. And because of that and related to the pandemic, we will not have an assistant director for the foreseeable future. So just be me. So there might be our responses might not be as prompt as they would have been in the past, because it'll just be me doing everything for fiscal for a little while. We're trying to identify some people around the office to help. But just ask for your patience as we head into the next formula review process. And so anything you can do to help me out will be greatly appreciated as we move into the next process.
Thank you, Crystal.
Crystal,
Yes.
this is Jolene. Can you hear me?
We can.
I was having.
Oh, you dropped off.
Have a few.
Jolene, hold on just 1 second. I think there are some people that don't have their phone muted. So if their computer muted, and so if it's not muted, you'll get a lot of feedback.
Okay, that sounds better, doesn't it? I had a few questions about the Schedule D that I wanted to just talk about a minute, if we could. For one thing, on the second tab where we're totaling up types of space, on the one line that talks about physical education and recreation space, it only lists the FICA codes for physical education space, I believe. Do we not intend to put the codes that define recreation space in there? I know the same thing happens on the space standards formula. You know, that's a different block of codes. I can't remember what they are, maybe in the 600s.
I'm going to leave that question to Patty because while we collect this information, we don't use this information in fiscal policy. So the PFI I think is specific to capital projects. Is that correct, Patty?
Yes, and I'm going to defer to Art and Carl and for their comments about the coding of that space, because this is the area that gets confusing.
Theoretically, the coding shouldn't be counting the athletic facilities, but it should be counting physical education and recreation in that those are on the instructional side of the chart. So I'm not sure, Jolene, really what you're asking for. There should be actually, I think, more definitive coding so you could separate out physical education, which is an instructional component, from recreation, from athletics. But right now, the coding really doesn't do that.
Well, I guess the confusion for me is that in the formula, in the funding formula, we're not being allowed to count recreation space as something that is funded. So, I mean, what's here with this line? We do get funded for physical education space. Do not get funded for recreation space.
And I think that's what was intended here. We're trying to look at the same basic data. Art, we talked about that sometime earlier, is probably recreation should not be included here. Isn't that what we concluded?
Yeah, I think so.
So the numbers are right. The word recreation probably should not appear in that heading there. It just
Exactly.
should be physical education and the physical education code numbers and not recreation. Art, is that how you remember that?
Yep, I think that's the way the discussion went.
That would make sense to me, Carl, to clean that up a little bit there. And the same thing is true of the matrix on the space standards
Yep.
formula. If I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
The
You are
wording
correct, Jolene.
the wording in the codes do not match up.
Right.
Okay.
Because we are looking at the physical education, or THEC is, and not recreation, as you pointed out. So it looks like that line is cleaned up already.
I aim to please.
Well, that'll clarify a lot of confusion.
Well, and thank you, Jolene, for that. And we'll make sure that the next version that goes out this summer will not have recreation in the PFI summary, and we'll just say physical education. So I really appreciate that that note.
Well, I've gone by the numbers there, as Carl said, but I always wondered, well, was that the intent? So I think cleaning up the label will help anybody that might come behind one of us that hasn't had this conversation with you. So the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was the 15-hour rule for spaces in athletic facilities. And what we count in athletic and other auxiliary facilities, what we can count as E&G and what we can't. In some of our athletic type buildings they're coded overall as an athletic building, particularly at Chattanooga and Martin. We do have classrooms that would meet the 15-hour per week rule, and that's fine. But we've also got some departments, academic departments, that reside in those buildings. They have faculty offices, or their whole department of offices is in that building, as faculty offices as well as support staff and that sort of thing. So I assume those spaces count as E&G. They are used in that regard on a full-time basis. What kind of documentation do you need for that? I've just been putting a comment in the cell as to what the E&G square footage covered. Do we need to be turning in some other kind of documentation about spaces that are used that way?
This is a good question, Jolene, and I know this gets into a gray area. The instruction document identifies that coaches' offices, if their salaries are paid by the athletic department, should not be considered E&G square footage. But you're talking about faculty members, I assume, who are providing instruction in either in say exercise science or some other physical education major.
Exactly.
I would think that the materials that we would need would just be potentially a list of the faculty members who are in those offices, and that would be enough for us. So that if a question were to come back and say, why are you counting these offices? We would be able to say, these are the faculty that are in those offices. And therefore, if an auditor wanted to say, look up that faculty member to make sure that they're actually instructing in exercise science or doing some sort of academic programming, they would be able to identify that person on, say, a web search or something at that institution.
And would that apply to other spaces associated with those faculty offices, like a support person's office? I mean, you take the academic department setup for those folks and you plop it down in a physical education building. So there are other spaces besides just a faculty office that are there for the operation of the academic office, academic department.
Right. Well, and the use codes clearly identify office space and classroom office space as academic in nature. And so, yeah, I would assume that you would just identify who is occupying that space within the auxiliary building as being a part of the education and general purpose.
Jolene, are you talking about like conference rooms and faculty storage and equipment rooms?
Yes, exactly. I mean, you know, you've got an academic department sitting there. Obviously, they've got to have a room for their mail room and printers and whatever it takes to run their office. That's all part of running a department.
I would include the office and then the office support code spaces also.
That's my question exactly, Carl.
Art, do you agree with that?
Yep. I would also include, you know, if they have a lab there or something else going on that's part of their department, I'd include that too, no?
Yeah.
Well, does the lab or the or a classroom that's designated for them in that building, that I assume that has to meet the 15-hour rule?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. We would want them to be using that lab for on average 15 hours per week per semester.
Okay. Now you've got things like the area that the pool is located in, and we have physical education classes that are taught there in the pool that meet the 15-hour rule. But you also have support areas for that pool. I mean, obviously, they're not going to come use that facility without having to use the changing rooms, the locker rooms, and so forth. So what do you do about that?
Jolene, generally, is that pool open to the public?
Well, it would depend. I mean, at Knoxville, the aquatic center where classes are taught it isn't used that much anymore for just general recreation use, because they have another pool that belongs to the THEC center used for that. So
yeah, I mean, these are all gray area questions. So I mean, I don't know, because
a little bit more for you, I guess.
yeah, you know, it's like we want to be fair, but also if we're trying to justify tens of thousands of, or, you know, thousands of square feet for a swimming pool because you're offering aquatics classes as your physical education component, like requirement. I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to be able, we need to be able to justify the inclusion of that space, right? And it can be difficult to try and explain it. We went back and forth with an institution last year about this, related to, I think they were offering scuba classes. And, you know, in general, we want to limit the amount of space to that which is actually being used for academic purposes. Yeah.
Jolene, one of the things that we did, I believe it was at Pellissippi a few years ago, was in the bubble, as they call it. What we tried to do is approximate the time and space that was used for classes, which occurred various places in the bubble. And we arrived at a percentage of the bubble and the direct support space that was used for classes. And we looked at the schedule, and we looked at the people in the space, and tried to work with the campus to come up with a reasonable percentage allocation. Because you know, there was public use, there was just open use, and there was recreational use as well as classroom. So what we tried to do is approximate what percentage was really academic.
Well, I can see
Answer,
that,
Crystal.
especially in big spaces like that. I guess in general, I always look at this 15-hour rule in these types of buildings, and it still bothers me a little bit, because there are spaces used that we get absolutely no credit for, simply because we don't meet the 15-hour rule. I mean, if you have a peak time of the day that physical education classes are offered in these buildings. Obviously, you can't schedule all of them to the same room so that you load a room to get your 15-hour mark. You may be scattered across, and we always have a number of rooms that are used, but they may fall at 12 hours a week, but it's a scheduling thing. So you're asking your registrar folks to do a real dance with scheduling to try to meet your 15-hour rule. I mean, to me, it seems like there should be some way to count up the total number of hours, academic hours, that are happening in these buildings and come up with some sort of percentage that gives you credit for all of the academic use. I mean, that considers all of it in some way, rather than just those rooms that you manage to meet the 15-hour rule on.
Jolene, that's a reasonable comment, but how you do that, I don't know. Because like campuses schedule tennis and golf out of a building, and their golf obviously is not in a building, but you got to put the credit hour somewhere. So you get into all of those fuzzy things that where they're scheduled at some place just because you've got to have a home for that class, but they really don't occur in the space. So I don't know.
Well, now our registration systems don't necessarily list a location on everything. Maybe yours requires that. So we naturally are dropping those classes out simply because they don't have a location in the timetable. A building location,
Yeah.
So I think the purpose of the 15 hours, first of all, we used to not count any of it. I mean, we'll start there. We used to not count any of it. So then we were trying to identify a middle ground, and half of the recommended THEC utilization hours seemed appropriate. Additionally, related to the 15 credit hours on average per week, I think the thought is we are asking you to try and be as efficient with your space usage as possible. Everything at THEC is asking for that. So really all the way from the capital outlay request process, all the way down through the master planning process. And then there's also the mechanical nature of being able to try and determine use of space if you were to just add up all academic hours. I'm sure that there probably is a better way to measure that, and we're happy to continue those discussions during the next review process if it's time to look at the fixed cost component again. Patty, I see you have a question here from a participant related to the year online start, and the year online start is the academic year. I think in general is when we're thinking about it. So I think that's right. So if you tell us that a new building is going to be open for your fall semester, we would count that as 100% online. And so that's the academic year rather than the fiscal year, because you might not have a building that opens on July 1, but it would open for the beginning of your fall semester on August 1 or September 1. I will double check that. I will verify that with another member of my team, but I'm pretty sure it's academic year. And then I will get back to you if that's not the case. I know it's not calendar year. I do know that that's not right. So, but I'll determine the difference between fiscal and academic.
Thank you, Crystal. Are there any other burning questions here folks want to ask? And you certainly can forward questions to me and Crystal after this as you talk about it in-house and forward those on. So one more chance here. Any other questions folks want to ask now with the group?
Patty?
Yes.
This is Kathy Johnson. Just wondered if if you've had any inquiries about transitioning auxiliary space as a result of COVID-19. We're definitely looking at that. And it's a temporary change, but who knows how long?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think this is one of the things that is on our radar as one of the potential effects of COVID. The interesting thing is, though, the way the Schedule D works is in this summer, you're going to be telling us how your space is going to be used for 21-22, not 2021. And so I think the general hope and belief is that we will be back to maybe normal classes by 21-22. I know that that is going to complicate the conversation even more, but this is definitely something that is on our radar, that is on our list of things to address and look into before the instructions go out. I could foresee a supplemental instruction related to how to treat auxiliary spaces that you are repurposing for academic purposes in order to have your proper social distancing and all of that. I was interested to hear that there's going to be a meeting later about that, the social distancing and how to better use your classrooms, which will then, one would think push you into some auxiliary spaces potentially. But yeah, that's definitely on our radar. We do recognize that as something that institutions are going to have to deal with, but and we're in the early stages of discussing that. So, but I'll make a note.
Thank you, Kathy.
You're welcome.
So I think we're going to wrap up here, and we're going to take a 15-minute break. So that would put us at 9:18. We'll call it, I'm sorry, 9:45, 46, 47, 9:47. So we'll be at let's call it 9:50. We'll reconvene. And everyone, please take a break, and we'll just leave this on, and we'll reconvene here in just a little over 15 minutes. Thank you, Crystal. That was great. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
I think she's going to be signing off. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, let me know if there are any more questions. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Bye-bye. All right.
Did I lose you, Patty?
I'm here. I just handed the controls over to you.
I'm the presenter, so let's see. I need to share my screen somehow, don't I? Share content. Share that. Can you see that?
Yes.
That's good.
Looks good. You may want to go to the presentation view. There you go.
How's that?
Looks good.
All right.
Terrific.
So we got what,
Okay.
15 minutes?
15 minutes. So I'm going to depart momentarily and shall return. So you're all set, Art?
I am.
Okay, good deal. I'm going to mute myself here.
Yep, see, the fence is down on the ground. You can see it, the fence does sit down right on the ground.
So we're getting close here to 9:50, and I'll just start with a few logistics here. Everyone, if you can keep your mic on mute during the presentation, that will help cut down on the feedback a little bit. And I would invite everyone to use the chat feature. I'm trying to monitor it. There's just been a handful of questions coming through, and I'll speak on behalf of Art. I believe he said he doesn't mind if someone just pipes in and asks a question mid-presentation, that's fine, but we will monitor the chat and then afterward have some time for Q&A. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce Art Litsky. Many of you know Art and have worked with Art. He has been working in the area of planning as a planning consultant since 1971. He became principal of what is now Dover Litsky Maté in 1988. He's received numerous awards for his planning across the country, and including the Distinguished Service Award for creation of the SCUP Planning Institute in 2016, and prior to that, the SCUP Founders Award for Exceptional Achievement in Higher Education Planning in 2006. He has worked on multiple campuses across the state and is very familiar with the state of Tennessee and THEC processes and so on, and is as well suited as anyone could be to be giving this presentation. This presentation is, I'll call it a basic presentation, but as you all know who work with space, you get into the subject and suddenly you get into all kinds of discussions and nuances right off the bat. And so we're going to cover the basics and beyond. And so I'd like to introduce Art Litsky. Art?
Thanks, Patty. So I have about 656 slides to show you over the next half an hour or so. Sometime at the end of my presentation, we're going to open it up to a panel discussion with Jolene and Kathy and Ann joining the conversation. So let me start. One question I think is important to address is why have a physical inventory and why maintain it? And it's important for a number of reasons listed here. Basically, you can't plan without knowing what you have, without having a way to measure what you have. And the facility inventory is one early way to do that. So it's key for strategic planning, it's key for campus planning, obviously for day-to-day operations, for maintenance and safety and so on. So it's also important for those of you who are involved with research as a major component of your academic program, for cost recovery, and it's also necessary for space analysis. So all of these items on this slide are important factors that say here's why it's important to do a PFI in one way or the other. And there are a variety of different ways that institutions address this. So the PFI that you're using has as a history It started in 1970 something, 1968, 1966. It was started by the federal government. It required all colleges and universities to respond. They asked for information about enrollment, about faculty, and facilities. And they created the space taxonomy that you're using now in one way or the other. That was then, let's see, I'm stuck. What's going on here? Then that was stopped, actually, and iPads began in 1988, but they no longer collect information on facilities. A group of folks got together from the National Center for Educational Statistics in 2006, and they sort of updated the codes that were started by HEGIS and created what's called the Facility Inventory Classification Manual, FICM, which is basically what we're using today on many campuses now. And for a little bit of time, SCUP started to collect that information in a database for about 3 years until they realized that it was way too expensive for them to do so, and so they stopped. But basically, what you're doing now for your facilities inventory started in '66 under HEGIS, and it grew out of the FICM numbers, and that's the coding that we're using now. And that manual on your left-hand side is about a 100-page document that sort of describes all of the elements that they use in trying to define space. So one thing I think that is important is to understand how they're measuring space, because basically what you're looking at is gross and net assignable square feet. So if this is a 3-story building, all of that space from the outside wall to the outside wall is considered gross. If you added that up on all 3 floors, the attic, the second floor, the first, and the ground floor, that would be the gross square feet of that building. The net assignable square feet is the interior spaces, all the interior spaces that are used for the activities that support that building. That's the net assignable square feet. Each space is measured from the wall surface to the wall surface. The circulation is not considered net, that's considered part of the net usable space, but that's also another important component about how you define what that is. And there's, a couple of pages worth of documentation in that manual that helps you try to understand what they mean by gross and net assignable and by net usable. So one issue, I guess, that we all face is the definition of how to think about circulation space in corridors. So on the left-hand side, you have a corridor that's also being used for laboratory activity, and those spaces that are just outlined in red actually are net spaces. So you would need to be able to cut that space out of the circulation and add that to the net assignable square feet. On the right-hand side, the students that are in that corridor, although it's a study space, and although they're working together, that's an unofficial use of it, and you still count that corridor as a corridor. Here we have a little bit more of a problem. I think those spaces that are in that bubble in red on the left-hand side should be counted as net assignable space. Just, counting those little areas, because they are being used that way. Whereas the rest of it is sort of junk in the corridor, and that should not be counted. On the right-hand side, those flaps sit down as benches. And I think that because of that, that area in the dotted line should be counted as net assignable square feet from the overall circulation space. But let me get into a little bit more detail about how the FICM manual and how Tennessee is describing space. So essentially all buildings consist of gross square feet, net usable square feet, and net assignable square feet. The net assignable square feet in an academic setting consists of these different categories of spaces. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about that in a moment. But that is the net assignable square feet. The net usable square feet is the space that is lobbies, corridors, elevators, bathrooms. And then there's the structure of the building, and we have the gross square feet. So the net is all of the usable spaces within the building, and that could be a number, whatever that number is. If you divide that number by the gross square feet, which is the overall of the building, you get a ratio, the net to gross ratio. It used to be called, and maybe still is called by some, the efficiency ratio, but it's not really a judgment of efficiency. It is the proportion of net assignable square feet to the gross square feet, and it differs by building type. So a science building will have a low net to gross ratio potentially it could be about 50% or less. Whereas a library might have a higher net to gross ratio, maybe 70% or more. So the net to gross ratio is different depending upon the building type, but the net can never be larger than the gross. And yet, in some of the PFIs that I've seen on your campuses, we have buildings that have exactly the same net assignable space as gross square feet, and that's an impossible situation. So that's an easy flag that there's a problem with that particular building or the data that you have that you're using to measure it. It should never be the same. It can't be the same. So I know that you can't read this. In fact, if you could read the line at 11, you still can't read this chart. But let me tell you how this sort of breaks down. These are the different codes that are in the FICA manual. Those codes that are in the 0 category are inactive spaces. Those spaces that are in the 100 classification are classrooms and classroom service. Those that are 200 are laboratories, those that are 300 are office, 400 are study, and so on. And it breaks it out in fairly specific detail. Those things that are 700 are service related, that are more institution-wide types of spaces. We have healthcare, we have residential, and then we have non-assignable space. So the inactive spaces are spaces that are being renovated, those spaces that are unfinished. Those actually still are net spaces, even though you can count them or not. But those are still in the net assignable types of spaces, if you can classify it that way. These things listed here are part of the net usable space and are not net assignable. But we still need to track that because they are spaces that occupy the building or that are occupied in the building, but those are net assignable spaces. So let me start to go through some of the detail behind some of these spaces and look carefully at them. Anything that ends in a 5, like a 115 or 215 or 355, are all service spaces or support spaces to this number that's higher than that, or lower than that actually. So classrooms are 110 and classroom service are 115. Now, some institutions have added their own coding to this to sort of break out into more detail. So some institutions have a 110 classroom is a general classroom, a 111 classroom is a seminar, a 112 classroom is a lecture room, and so on. But basically, the FICOM manual keeps it simple. 110 is a classroom independent of the scale of it. There's a category that is conference rooms, which are considered 350, meeting rooms at 680, and auditoria at 610. These are not classrooms, and we'll get into that in a little bit more, even though sometimes they might be scheduled for classroom purposes. So here we have 3 examples of a conference room, a meeting room, a seminar room. They look exactly the same. There's nothing to distinguish them other than the way in which they are actually used. And that's the important part of this. It's how those are used is what makes it a classroom or a meeting room or a conference room. So the room on the very right actually is a seminar room. The room on the very left is a conference room, and the meeting room is here. And again, it's how they are being used that is what's critically important. sometimes use a conference room and have a course scheduled in it. But it's still a conference room. It's not a seminar room. It's not a meeting room. Meeting rooms are more public in nature and are used by a variety of different departments. Conference rooms are specific to a department, and seminar rooms, like the one on the right, are general purpose instructional spaces. Classroom service, these are the 115 types of spaces. These are not considered 700 numbers, 710 or 715, which are central technology, computer telecommunications, because that coding is for campus-wide spaces, like a large server room and so on. These are specific to the functions of a classroom or a laboratory. These rooms are not 110 classrooms. They're class labs, or they are open labs. So these are 210 spaces or 220 spaces. And it's important to distinguish that, particularly when you're getting into looking at classroom utilization, laboratory utilization. It muddies the water when these are called classrooms, when in fact they should be called laboratories. There are the class labs or class studio spaces. Rooms that are categorized by special equipment or specific activities that tie instructional or research activities or to a specific discipline are not generic in nature, and these are typically classroom or studio, laboratory or studio spaces. They are scheduled spaces. They're not open spaces, open laboratory spaces. They're not research laboratories. They have courses that are scheduled in them, and that's what makes them a class laboratory, the 210 type space. Again, there are some institutions that have taken the 210 number and said that we need to be able to distinguish this for our own particular purposes from a wet lab versus a dry lab. And so they have they've taken the 210 and added a 211 or a 212 to make those distinctions. They're still instructional spaces. They're still in the 200 category as opposed to the 100 category. And we need to be careful that we still track those labs that are open for academic activity, but are not scheduled for instructional purposes. And again, those are the 220 types of spaces. These are class lab studio spaces. They're 210 spaces. They have courses that are taught in them that are scheduled by the registrar. So we have the art studio, we have the music studio, and we have actually a digital motion laboratory. These are not spaces that are part of the 710 or 711 type of classification. These are instructional spaces, and they are 210 laboratories. These are lab service. The one on the left-hand side is a THEC lab that supports the 210 type of activity. Even though there's an office space in here where the technician sits, it's that person's workroom, and that's a 215 support space for the laboratory that it supports. On the right-hand side is a makerspace. It's an open lab. And there are a variety of different spaces that make up the makerspace, but those are all on schedule spaces that are open for students to come in and do their work without it being used for instruction. Research labs are exactly that. They are used for research, faculty, staff, and student research. Even though you might have an undergraduate students in your research space, it is a research space, and those are 250 labs. And labs that service those research spaces are 255 category spaces. And those might be instrumentation rooms, they might be prep rooms, they might be a variety of different types of equipment type spaces, tissue culture rooms that are part of the research laboratory activity. Some research support spaces are also being used for instructional space, and then you need to decide how you want to categorize that. Is it really a research support space, or is it instructional space support space? Office category. I wish that the FICOM codes distinguish between a faculty office and a staff office and a technician's office and administrator's office, but the coding is just 310 for faculty office space. And I love these spaces because they are all functioning faculty offices. The one on the left is my favorite. There actually, oops, sorry. There actually is a space back here for the faculty member to sit. There's the end of his monitor. I just can't picture working in that environment, but he's comfortable building a wall like that. So anyway, these are 310 faculty offices. The spaces that support that are 315, so the file rooms, work rooms, copy rooms are all part of the 315 category. Storage, office storage space, like the one on the right is a 315 storage. Now here's the photograph in the middle. To me, is a funny way to think about it, but it makes sense in the end. This is sort of the space that is the anteroom to faculty office spaces that are around that room. Each of these doors open into a faculty office. So this is not assigned to any one particular person, although there might be someone a student who works there and so on. So that would be considered an office service space, a 315 space. This, on the other hand, on the left-hand side, is an active space. There are 3 stations in it, even though there are spaces where it is set aside with cubicles, that's all one space. And that larger space with those 3 cubicles, 3 stations, are counted as one 310 space. It's an office space. So again, it depends upon how those spaces are being used. I saw on a number of different campuses where the central storage space, 730, which is a category for support for the college, for the entire university, was being used for office service space, meaning it was categorized as a 730 space, 735 space. And that's a false way to think about that category. The 730 category is institution-wide, whereas the 315 category is specific to a department or to a college and not a central program or space. This is just another way to think about offices, and each of these offices should be counted as one station, one occupant, even though there are seating assignments for different numbers of people. So the one on the left has the official, or more official, the assigned space to the one station. These 2 stations are for guests. Here it is a larger space. It has a small conference room. These are guests. It's assigned to one station. And for a faculty member here that's a little larger, again, these are guests for one station. So when you're looking at an office, you want to be able to say this office, despite its size, and despite that it has 6 other chairs in it, is really assigned to one person. Otherwise, you'll lose track of whether or not it's a shared space with 2 faculty members sharing a space or 3 faculty members sharing a space. So that's one assigned space. We get into the same question again, is how those rooms are being used. A conference room is a 350 used primarily for staff meetings and department activities. A meeting room is available for general use, and a seminar is strictly used for instructional purposes. And again, even though it looks the same, the furniture and the sign on the door says one thing, it's how they're being used that sets the stage for how to classify that space. So the 400 category is actually called study and not library. Because how we think about these spaces when they appear in other buildings is, I think, really important. These are all study rooms in a library. And this is open stack study rooms, open stack study rooms, open stack study rooms, where it's a shared environment with study and with stacks. There is a category for just stacks, where it's just the stack space, library storage space, and so on. But these are 430 category, just shared space, stack, and study. Here's where it gets funny, because I think that spaces that we might have called a lounge, depending upon how they're used, can also be called a study space. So here on the left-hand side, library, this is a space in an academic building. This part of the space is probably, could be considered a lounge. This space, part of it, can be called a study space, a 410 study space. So you could divide that space proportionally into study and lounge. This space is strictly, the one in the middle is strictly a study space. It is used for study, used for interaction by students. And the space on the right-hand side is definitely a lounge space. Even though you might have students studying in it, it's designed for lounge type activity. So again, depending upon how the study space is being used or how the space is being used would help you define how it is. So study space includes reading rooms located in libraries, reading rooms in residential facilities or in academic or student surface space. Study carrels and booth areas are similar spaces that are intended for general study purposes. This category does not include lounges that are intended for relaxation and casual interaction. Jolene, here's where we get into the question of athletics and recreation and physical education and so on. These are all considered athletic physical education 520 in the definition of the taxonomy. So the taxonomy for the category special considers, military training rooms, athletic and physical education spaces, media production, demonstration areas, field buildings, animal quarters, greenhouses, and so on. So here, a clinic that is not a clinic for health purposes is a 540 number. It's a special category in the 500 sequence of spaces. This is at a College of Law clinic. Greenhouse is obvious, animal facilities are obvious. But I think we need to distinguish between a clinic that is used for educational purposes and one that's used for healthcare, which is a 800 number. This is a more general, coding for a variety of different types of spaces, from assembly to exhibition space, food services, lounge, merchandising, and so on. So the space on the right is a food service, food facilities type of space. So here's something that I think is interesting to ask yourself about. What type of space is this indoor atrium? I took a photograph of it several times during the course of the day. During the day, there are tables set aside where students can study. There's also a luncheonette here where students come out and they can use the tables for eating. But later on in the day, it looks like this, because this school is using this for a variety of different assembly and programs. So how would you measure, what would you call that space? In a way, it's a large atrium that you could divide up into, putting a boundary around some of those spaces and say, here's what's net assignable and here's what's not. I would almost categorize this as an assembly space. Whether you take out the circulation space or not, because in this particular situation, this particular school uses this way on the right-hand side about 5 or 6 or 7 times during the course of a week. and they set it up that way, it's used that way, and then when those assemblies are gone, and those last for several hours, it goes back to what it looks like on the left-hand side. So I think you have to use your judgment about how to categorize those different types of spaces so that it makes sense to you in terms of how you're using those spaces. The 700 category service, this consists of things that are system-wide, that's institution-wide, that are specific to the overall running and operation of a campus. So it has institutional shops, it has central storage area, vehicle storage area, and so on. So this data center on the left and right is a server room for the entire university. It is not a 215 type of space, it's a 710 space. You might have server rooms in an academic building, but those are then 215 spaces or 255 spaces because they're serving a particular function, academic function, specific to a discipline. Whereas the server room here is specific to the whole institution. So it makes it a 700 number. A large storage space, central storage space, warehouse, and so on, is again an institution-wide resource. A small storage space within an academic building for classrooms or laboratories and so on, or offices, should not be categorized as a 700 number because they are specific again to that discipline, whereas this large central storage is central to the entire institution. This space on the right-hand side is an instructional laboratory, although it's called a shop. It should be called and categorized as a 200 number or 220 number or 225 number, whatever it is in terms of support. It is not an institutional shop that would be a 700 number. It's an instructional lab. Again, it depends on how it is being used. That sets the stage for how that space would be categorized. Healthcare. Again, it depends upon how the space is being used. On the left-hand side, we have a treatment examination room in a healthcare clinic. That's an 800 number. The two spaces on the two photographs on the right, or central, middle and right, are instructional spaces. Those are class laboratory spaces. Those are part of, in this case, the nursing programs for an institution. Again, we need to differentiate between an instructional lab, a 200 lab, and an 800 lab, which is geared strictly for patient care. And then we have space for residential, and it breaks down into a whole variety of categories that are specific to residential environments. So that's a real quick review of some of the issues that you face when you're trying to make a judgment about how to deal with a variety of different space uses as they have evolved from when the coding was first created. And the coding was first created in general in 1966. And it was updated in 2006. But now we have a variety of different types of spaces now that are different, that don't necessarily easily fit into the coding. And so you have to see how they are being used to make a decision about what's right for your institution and what's right for the state. So I'm going to open it up to Jolene and Kathy and Ann to talk about any of the questions that they might have, to talk about the processes that they go through on their campus for updating and maintaining the PFI in their institution, any problem spaces that they have that they want to talk about. We should also talk about whether or not you think we should have some changes in the coding to make it easier and more up to date for your particular institution. Jolene, you want to start?
Well, I don't know what part of that you would want me to talk about, but at UT's institutions, as far as updating and maintaining the PFI, we have designated folks in the facilities area that do that throughout the year as because they're tracking renovations and changes to the space in general. They're moving people, moving departments around and that sort of thing. So they try to update spaces as they do those activities through the year. But then in the spring, we kick off a survey period where we open a piece of software to the various departments, and there's a designated person in those departments to review the space that they use and make any changes that have been overlooked by the facility staff, or sometimes there are changes that the facility staff simply doesn't know about. People move different folks around or change the purpose of a room, and the facilities folks have no way of knowing that. So the departments update their spaces based on what has happened through the year. That gets pretty detailed for research spaces because that is also where we have them give us a lot of information about grants that are worked on in this and that sort of thing in order to satisfy F&A review processes. So that's kind of how we deal with updating and maintaining our PFI.
Do you find that some of the folks who review their space are basically just saying, yep, this is right, and it's perfunctory, and they don't really look at it carefully?
Oh, sure. We have some of that. And we have some edit checks and so forth that give us a clue that that might be going on, and we try to discourage that. Sometimes it's by questioning things, or and a lot of it's just an education process. We do a lot of training when the survey comes along, and I try to let them know all the different ways this information is used and how it's important to the university, how it ties into funding in many instances. So that puts a little more pressure on them to do a pretty good job of this, and many do, actually. Another thing that's happening at the Knoxville campus now, they're just starting this, and they've even had to postpone it now probably another year because of the COVID situation. They are going to start tying budgeting to the space that a department uses. So that's going to put a little extra pressure on departments to be efficient with their space and so forth. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
You mean you're going to charge for their space?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, in some way they will be charged for their space.
Great idea. Kathy, you want to add?
Our process is similar. We started the strategic resource investment years ago, and it was incredible what it did to capturing space data because space I would say, had a value. It changed the way people looked at the document that they'd just been signing and sending back because of the transparency of that document. Folks began to really scrub it and still do. We're inundated after the budget meetings with people saying, hey, where did all this square footage come from? Well, it came from the annual report you signed and sent back. So that's been kind of a huge benefit to people. Tried to give us space back actually when we launched that, which was interesting. So that's been helpful for us.
Ann? Did we lose Ann? Maybe. What about problem spaces that you have that are you're struggling with trying to define one way or the other?
Well, many of our coding problems at UT fall along the lines of some of the ones that you pointed out in your discussion. People using central storage where they shouldn't, uh, various things along those lines. I mean, we do have some odd spaces that come up from time to time, and we try not to drop them into a code that is for other special use, which we try to ask them to use that on rare occasions, but sometimes it's difficult to know what to do. I mean, I had a question just a couple of days ago about a call center. We have a call center that the development people use. So, what do you call that? I'd be interested in your idea of that, Art.
I guess I would call that office support, office service. Actually, that's an interesting, how would I call that? I'd walk in and there's a whole bunch of people sitting at telephones or sitting at their computers.
44 stations.
Computer stations, right?
Yes, phone and computer stations, I believe.
It's got to be a service, a ending in a 5, one way or the other. What did you call it?
Well, right now we were talking about putting it under other special use, the code for other special use, which is, I think it's 59 or something. It's sort of in terms of the space standards, how it gets counted in the space standards. I think it was sort of a moot point because it's not ENG space. It's something that is taken care of by the foundation. It's a foundation space. So by virtue of that definition, we don't count that as ENG space. Foundation space is auxiliary space. So it gets dropped out of the space standards calculation because of that. So it becomes a little less important what you call it, I guess.
But so it's in part of the development office's space, I'm assuming. So just for a moment, you'd have their work rooms, you'd have the file rooms, you'd have copy rooms and so on. Why couldn't the call center space be considered a support to that office type of program, the 315?
Well, I suppose it could. I mean, we're just trying to kick around reasonable ideas for that.
Yep. Good question. So what happens, how is that space used when they're not using it for a drive?
I assume it's probably not used. I would have to ask some more questions to know exactly. I don't know. I mean, I assume they have some of that going on just about all of the time.
Yep.
Jolene and Kathy, what level of information do you send out to all of the department personnel for their validation?
We send what you send us. It has a little bit of detail. The call letter's a little bit lengthy, but we do send, some portions of the manual out. It's primarily the space use codes. We then ask supplemental information, like we're asking for number of occupants and other things, but most of what we send out as a reference document is the items that we have that you guys provide annually. And sometimes that we invite them to have us come and break that down, and we get questions, but we're basically sending the instructions we get.
Do you ever have a training session with them where you bring them all together?
That'd be great to do, but I don't, other than one-on-one trainings or, folks from certain departments, I don't think we've ever had a comprehensive training, not since I've been here.
Mhm.
It'd be good to have, because those become opportunities to share the benefit of capturing the space. And we try to, do that as much as we can, because it incentivizes folks to be honest. And when they know there's a benefit for them, they're a little more honest about what they report.
I know that some R1 research universities have a weekend sort of retreat where they bring all their folks together to go through the whole, taxonomy and make sure everybody is on the same page. Because to them, the cost recovery is critically important to them. They want to make sure that they're capturing everything.
That's a good idea.
We put just about every piece of information about our room out to the department folks. To not all of them to update. I mean, some of them are just informational pieces for them, like square footage, for example. We don't want them thinking they're going to measure rooms and change square footages or anything like that, but we do show them that number so that they can, it helps them look at a space and know they're in the right place and it looks like the size it should be and that sort of thing. But, we ask them to update the area codes. We have various other codes that we're using internally that don't have anything to do with the FICA manual. We provide an appendices to their instructions that has the entire set of definitions out of the FICA manual for area types. And we do extensive training every spring. I mean, people are not required to do the training, but we have pretty good participation at most campuses. I have for years gone around and done that in person. Just made a circuit around the state and done that in person with folks. Of course, this year we weren't able to do that, so we've done all of it by Zoom. I've just finished all of those sessions, actually. And I think that's really valuable to the process, to be honest with you. I don't, otherwise there's just too much gray area that people read things into that aren't there if you don't give them some pretty good guidance. We even have, besides the basic room data that they are providing for us, they're also updating a screen that in the case of research universities, it's extremely important to the F&A process if it's a research space, but we actually have people fill it out for every single space. It's just much simpler if it's not a research space, but we have them tell us percentage-wise how a room is used and by what cost center. And of course, the cost centers have function codes with them so that we know if that's a research function that the work is tied to, or a public service function, or academic support, et cetera. It all ties into the financial system where the accounts are set up and the functions set for those, and one thing and another. And then there's a personnel screen that's tied to the room, and if it's the type of room that should have people assigned to it, they tell us who is in that room. If it's a research space, we capture everybody that has worked in that space during the fiscal year that the research would aim to. All of that ties into the F&A review process, which we did an extensive study with some consultants on several years back when we set up this system in order to capture a lot of what the F&A folks wanted. And you mentioned earlier about the FICM codes only having like one office code. That is an area where we have many different types of office codes, and it's that we've instituted at UT within that 310 area in order to separate, what is faculty, what is clerical space, what is program staff space, which would be people primarily involved in research and public service, because all of those things have some bearing on the F&A process.
Yep. But I think that's important for just for general campuses as well, not just the research institutions. I'd like to know, you know, how I want to be able to tell a faculty member whether or not their office is a certain size because it fits into the standard or not. I want to be able to distinguish between faculty office and student spaces, student office type spaces, and administrative spaces. It just makes sense to me when you're looking at an overall campus to be able to identify that in a little bit more detail than the codes allow us to do.
Right. If you're trying to evaluate your efficiency for what you've assigned to people, you almost have to have that, it seems to me, Art.
Yep. So how do you, there are now, you know, a sort of standard type of active learning space that's gone around the country now. You know, these round tables with monitors around the room that are being used in a variety of different ways, both for active learning and not. How do you categorize those spaces? Are those classrooms or laboratories or studios? Is there a sort of general agreement for how you should do that?
For us, laboratory.
Talking about these spaces being. Can you give an example, Art, of where you would see one of these?
Sure. So a number of campuses have created what they call an active learning classroom. And it is a room that has round tables and 6 to 7 to 9 people students sit around the table. And there are X number of tables in a room, let's say 10 or so tables with 6 or more students around the room. Each table has a set of laptops or computers or one computer that's set up to a monitor on the wall. So you might have, if you have 10 tables, you have 10 monitors around the room. And the faculty member uses that in a way where each table can be a student-oriented project where you can have all the students working together. You can divide that into 3 groups of each table into 3 groups or whatever it is, where they all can work together in an active sort of environment. If you think of the scale up, maybe you might recognize scale up as an environment that a number of institutions have put in place. That's the type of room I'm talking about. That's what I mean, Jolene. So how do you guys categorize that as a studio or as a classroom? Is it a 210 number or a 110 number?
Well, I am not familiar with those spaces at our institution, so I'm assuming that the departments are coding them, and I don't know what they're doing with them. So that sounds like an audit situation for me.
Let me see if I could find. Bear with. Can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Yes.
So this room here is an example of an active learning environment where there are tables and chairs around the room, and each table has their own monitor. This happens to be a room at MIT, but then there are other places, you know, where it's done like that. And I'm just wondering how you all are thinking about classifying that.
So in a college, those are class labs. I'm sorry, Patty.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in a college like engineering, that's a classroom laboratory. But if you put that kind of configuration, you know, we've proposed those rooms for libraries and their group study.
Yep.
Right. That's where I'm thinking we may have more of them as in the library areas.
But those would be more like, let's see, hold on. Let me get back to where I want to go. Those would be more like these types of spaces, no? You know, where they're separated out.
No, what's been proposed for our library looks like the picture you had on the right. You have people around, potentially around a single monitor or monitors. Yeah, that's something like that.
Yep. Well, we're seeing a number of libraries creating spaces like this throughout the country now. More and more libraries are moving books off campus or off site to provide places where students can gather and do collaborative work. And these would be study spaces, the 400 number. Sorry about that.
Well, I think it's interesting to think about this in terms of the space standards too, because I can see, I mean, it depends on what you're doing at those areas, whether they think of that class as a lab or not, and whether it's in the registration system as a lab.
Mm-hmm.
But
I think actually the whole context of that, why it was created originally, it was started, I think, in North Carolina State, I think, where the physics department didn't want to have a classroom or a laboratory. They wanted to merge the two together into a space where students can be actively involved in an assignment without having to go to a laboratory or to a classroom. So they created that type of shared environment where students are working together with their own monitors and so on. So I think would call it a 210 lab or studio.
okay, and then I'm trying to think how to translate that in the space standards, because I'm afraid that the registrar's office does not set that up as a lab class. They would call it this classroom, possibly.
Yep.
So you would end up putting it in, you know, a different category of space on the space standards. So I guess that behooves us to work between the two places to sync that up, or
I think one of the problems is that type of space needs a different type of space standard, because an active learning environment needs more room for students per seat than a typical classroom or lecture room. And so we need new standards to address that. But if it's counted as a classroom or is it counted as a laboratory, either way, you still need a new set of standards to address the way in which faculty, I think, are moving now towards more active learning environments.
And those environments are typically dedicated because often they're funded by departmental funds, right? That's not a general purpose typically. That is their specific activity and then a space designed around it, like a laboratory. It's class lab.
Yep, could be. Yep. Although once a department or a college creates it, there are other colleges or departments that want to be able to use it.
so what do we do in the meantime when we don't have a different space standard?
Well, I think I would still call it a 200 number, a lab studio.
I don't know what else other folks out there listening might want to know about our processes or whatever. So, you know, I guess if there's questions from other people, that would help the conversation here.
Let's move on to that. So I'm thanking you in advance, so don't throw anything. I know that there was a comment or a question about whether or not this presentation will be available, and I'm going to give it to Patty, the latest version of it, and she can give it to whoever wants a copy of it.
Art, this is Jim Cobb. I've been listening to you and Jolene comment back and forth. Is it a classroom or is it a lab? And the thought that's going through my mind is, I think of our accounting department in the College of Business, and several years ago, I believe I may have called Carl and asked Carl this question a few years ago. And, you know, accounting professors are teaching basic accounting and they're doing it in a classroom. And all of a sudden, computers show up in the classroom. So now that they have computers in there, does it become a class lab or is it still a classroom? And at that time, you know, they're teaching the same thing. It's used for multiple sections of the basic stuff, back to back to back to back. And at that time, we determined, well, it's a change in their teaching method, and it's not necessarily that specialized equipment is required for the teaching. So at that time, well, we kept coding those as classrooms, and we continue to do it that way to this day. So then I think about the work that you're doing on our master plan now, and I'm trying to imagine how many of those rooms we might have on campus, and I don't have a good feel for it right now. But if we just went out all of a sudden and changed all of those that were set up in another example you had shown, and all of a sudden we change those over to a 210, how does that affect the work that you're doing for us and looking at, as far as the master plan and looking at space utilization and trying to determine whether or not the number of our classrooms is adequate?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I think that those computer labs are lab spaces. They should be classified as 210. And to the extent that they were identified as computer labs in your inventory, that's the way we computer spaces, even though they're computer classrooms, that's the way we looked at them, as being laboratories, not classrooms. So that's specific to TTU, but I think that, let me go back up to that chart. It really is, these are, you can't teach a generic or general purpose classroom in a space like that. They are specific to the equipment that's in it. And in my mind, being that it's specific to the equipment, it is a laboratory space or studio space. It's not a generic general purpose classroom. There are, I'm going to screw things up. There are computer labs that I've seen there where you could drop the monitor down into the table itself so that it's a clear table and you don't see the monitor, so that a generic, you know, humanities course might be taught in there. But to me, this type of space is a laboratory space. So we could double check what we've done in terms of looking at those spaces in the inventory. But I think if there were comments that said that it was a computer classroom, we counted that as a 210. But we can double check that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions, Comments? I'll throw a question out there, and people may not be prepared to respond, and that is if there are any ideas out there about the PFIS and the inventory in general and the structure of it, use of it, or even something like the faculty office breakdown categories. If you have suggestions or things that you would like for us to look at as we transition, please send me your thoughts, or just speak up if you've got those thoughts right now about ideas that you might have about it.
Patty, this is Jim. There's just one other thing I would like to say. That Art mentioned it earlier that he wished we could assign different code numbers to different types of offices, faculty offices, administrative offices, grad student offices, and so on. And I believe the manual gives some examples of how to do that, like maybe a 310, a 311, a 312. And
Right.
I would just like to say that if there's some way, as we make changes to the way we do this, if there's some way we could do that, I also think it would be very helpful if we could incorporate that in some manner.
Yeah, it would be nice if it could be system-wide so that we don't have 16 different coding systems in place, but one that more or less everyone does in a consistent way. You know, the question about what some institutions are doing with wet and dry lab, you know, research institutions might need that. General, liberal arts institutions might not. But we need to have some sort of systematic way. And it's too bad that the FICA manual is not going to be updated as far as we know. But that would have been a great way to do it.
Hey, Patty, this is Mark Berner. I've got
Hey, Mark.
Hi, I've got the I have PFIS open now, and I'm looking at some of the fields. I have a question about them, like program type. I don't know if you were going to hit that later today. I'm not really. Let's see. Room. No, I'm sorry. Room sub-use code doesn't give you an option, as far as I can tell. Program type. Not clear on what that is. That it'd be helpful if you could answer what those two are. And maybe the sub-use code is you could program it to get what Jim's talking about.
Is that the SIP coding?
No, that's a separate category. I can't get anything to pop up in the room sub-use. So, for example, if it's a 300, 310, you could have a sub-use as a grad assistants, faculty, staff. I don't know.
Is Carl there? Is he able to jump in? I see him on the phone.
Is that meant, I don't know, but is that meant to have a room where it might be used for several purposes and you give a percentage?
Yes.
For
Yes.
use?
That was an answer to try to maintain the base of offices at all the same, but be able to further refine the offices with the secondary field. So as you say, Art, the high level everybody would be the same, but that information could be available. We did not at that time. The fields were not further defined. It's just an option, and there are 2 or 3 or more places in the PFIS that have potential for further refinement that was not done initially.
In regards to the program type, what's the best use of that? Because there's many different options. And I don't know if program type is covered under this FICM manual or not.
Well, I know the manual has this, the zip codes and classification for that. So it very well be. I'm not sure what it was meant on the Tennessee system.
The program type, it's 10 numbers 10 through 90, and it's 10 is instruction program, 11 is general academic instruction. I just go down the line: occupational, vocational, special sessions, extension, organized research program. It goes on and on.
Those were legacy definitions. They were from back when it was the COBOL system, and we were really just bringing that forward. That had to do with the overall cost study that's left over from the cost study. And so we kept that at the point. That's one that probably needs to be looked at.
What about taxonomy type? There's two numbers on that, 7200 and 0000.
You talking about the taxonomy code?
Yes. There are only two options though, and a drop down. It says, well, it's taxonomy type, not code. It's just above program type.
We'll have to look at that, Mark.
I have no idea.
I'll tell you what, we'll look into that and before our seminar this Friday and see if we can clarify some of that. Anything else? Well, thank you so much, everyone, especially to Art. Appreciate this great presentation, and this is a great step in kind of getting together. I wish there was a way that we actually could get together. Maybe one day we'll actually do that. But appreciate your joining us. Please send more questions. If you have any other questions you'd like for us to answer before Friday, please send them on to me, and I'll share with Art and Carl, and we'll go from there. And so as I mentioned before, we're following up with sort of individual phone calls, and we're just basically looking at the data that we have, see if there are any questions, and see if there are any questions that pop up. And but again, appreciate your time, and we'll conclude our session. I'm going to have to figure out how to share the recording, whether or not we can post it or we make it available in uCloud, but we'll make it available to you in case you want to access it for future reference. So hope everybody has a great day, and thank you to Art as well.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
I'll
Thank
send
you. Mm-hmm.
Patty, I'll send you the latest